Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be going into some rather complex territory, particularly when it comes to ways of interpreting the philosopher David Hume's version of what we call moral skepticism. So Hume scholars disagree on how best to interpret what exactly Hume is doing when it comes to morality and moral theory and things like that. So, and I'm not going to be covering everything. I'm just going to be covering some main points about Hume's moral philosophy. Okay, so take a lot of what I'm going to be saying in this video with a little bit of grain of salt because I'm operating from a certain way of interpreting what Hume is actually doing here. Okay, now, but before we talk about David Hume specifically, I just want to talk about skepticism in general. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that skepticism of any topic, not just moral skepticism, but any type of skepticism, is very different from ignorance. Okay, so ignorance and skepticism both involve knowledge, but skepticism and ignorance operate from different kinds of bases here. Okay, so ignorance is simply a matter about what you do not know. And when you're aware of your own ignorance, you are aware of that which you do not know. Now, but if you're merely ignorant, you're at least open to the possibility that you could know. Okay, so there are lots of things that we are ignorant about. I am ignorant about the contents of most psychology textbooks. But if you were to ask me, well, given enough time and energy and attention, could you learn? Well, yeah, I don't, theoretically, in principle, I don't think there's really any impetus here in learning more about the content of psychology textbooks. So I'm not making a skeptical claim about the nature of psychology. Now, skepticism, on the other hand, does involve a claim that the prospects of our knowledge are slim. So, skepticism would involve the claim that either there's a subject matter here that we can't have knowledge of, so it's a subject matter that's not settled, and that could be based on the fact that our powers of knowledge are very limited, that these kinds of subjects are just beyond our scope, or it could be for some kind of other reason. So what the skeptic does is the skeptic largely evaluates our attempts to gain knowledge or our attempts to possess knowledge, and then says, okay, well, our past attempts have failed, our current attempts to have knowledge of this area have failed, or there's problems within the subject matter or within the domain itself, which seems to make these kinds of topics out of reach. So the skeptic is making a further claim about the actual prospects of having knowledge of a given subject matter or domain of inquiry. So skepticism of a given domain of inquiry or a given subject matter would be like the chances of our actually gaining knowledge here are incredibly slim or maybe even impossible. All right, so skepticism is something very different from ignorance. Okay, now let's turn our attention to morality for a moment. All right, so I just want you to look at this picture for a little bit. Okay, this is a gentleman by the name of Gall. His real name is Christian, I believe, but let's forget that for a moment. Okay, and he is the lead singer of a band called Gorgoroth, which is a Norwegian, or not Norwegian, but a Scandinavian sort of satanic metal band. Okay, now, so here's my question. Does this look evil to you? And if so, why? Okay, so I mean, don't get me wrong. I love satanic metal as much as the next guy. I mean, who doesn't, right? But when and where was it decided that if there were like a devil, like if we want to be really satanic and we want our band to be like really evil and satanic, when was it decided that this is what satanic looks like? Black leather and upside down crosses and fake blood and white face paint and metal spikes and long hair and things like that. So why is this evil, or why is this satanic? Okay, so focus on these kinds of things. When you look at this kind of picture, what does looking at this kind of picture do to you? Does it disturb you? Does it make you sort of go, "Ugh"? Does it make you afraid? Is it the kind of things that you would have nightmares about potentially? When you listen to certain kinds of music and you're inclined to think that, well, this is evil music, right? So, I mean, all those grandmas out there, if you were to play Gorgoroth for them, and they'd be like, oh, this is such evil music. Okay, but is the evil kind of embedded within the notes? I mean, what is there to music other than an arrangement of notes and octaves and progressions and dynamics? That's all music is. Well, in order for music to be evil, I mean, is the evil just embedded within the note somewhere, or embedded within the time signature or the arrangement of those notes, right? If you think about it, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Now, David Hume actually has an answer to this. So David Hume is of the mind that our moral concepts, things like good and evil and right and wrong, actually correspond to our sentiments. Okay, so when we make an observation in the world, we witness an event in the world, or we witness a behavior, what we are conditioned to do is to name it good or evil or right or wrong based on the fact that when we witness these things, they tend to produce a certain kind of sentiment within us. So I will be inclined to call that which is good. I'll be inclined to call something good when it tends to correspond to feelings of approval, feelings of satisfaction, feelings of pleasure, feelings of joy, love, and happiness. Okay, so if I witness an event and it makes me happy, I say that is, that's a moral good. If it causes me pain or sorrow or anguish or disgust, I will call it evil. So if we wanted to divide animals, just non-human animals into good and evil, we think that puppies and kittens are good, and we think that scorpions and spiders are evil. Why? Because they scare us. I mean, they're the creepy crawlies, right? Okay, but scorpions and spiders aren't objectively evil. I mean, so if you see a big black emperor scorpion and you get the heebie-jeebies, because I mean, I would too. If a black emperor scorpion about that big walked across my floor right now, I'd be scrambling to get my shotgun and I'd be, I'd be taking that thing out, right? But if you were to ask me, are scorpions evil? I would say, well, no, they're not evil. I mean, they just are. So we call things good and evil, Hume thinks, when those things produce certain kinds of feelings or sentiments within us. Now, and this goes into his general theories about knowledge. So without going into it, because I could do like 4 lecture videos just on Hume's theory of knowledge, Hume falls in line with a theory of knowledge, well, a historical theory of knowledge known as empiricism. And empiricism involves several different kinds of claims. So Hume says, first of all of our useful knowledge is dependent upon experience. But there's 2 other aspects to Hume's empiricism, which is different from other empiricists like thinkers like John Locke and George Berkeley. So Hume says, yeah, all of our useful knowledge is dependent upon experience, but more importantly, our concepts themselves, the very ideas we have in mind are themselves sensations. So, to think about the concept of red is just to have a particular kind of red sensation. So theoretically, well, not even theoretically, if you didn't understand the concept of red, you ask me, what is red? The best way to provide you with that concept or that information is just to directly produce that experience, to bring a red object in front of you, and on the assumption that your powers of observation are working correctly, what is red? This right here. Perfect. My daughter's dump truck is sitting right here. So this is red. So the sensation you are aware of, what's going on internally when you look at this, that's red. Or you say, I don't understand the concept of cold. What is cold? Okay, well, here's what I will do. I will provide you just with empirical data that the word cold names. Okay, so go stand in that walk-in freezer for 10 minutes. It's 25 degrees below zero. Go stand outside for a while. What is pain? Okay, well, here, I'll punch you in the arm, right? Okay, so these kinds of words like red and cold, and pain and sweet and salty and smooth and coarse, these words are actual names for sensations. Okay, so there's a direct correspondence between the word cold and a given sensation or a given feeling. There's a direct correspondence between red, which is an English word. So, and this is really interesting. So if I say red, rojo, and rouge, those are three different words corresponding to three different natural languages, but they all correspond to the same sensation, right? They are names for sensation. Now, and Hume thinks that a lot of our concepts are just this. Our concepts are just names for certain kinds of sensations. So our very concept of an apple is just a name for a collection of sensations, right? Okay, so that means then if we want to determine the meaning of our moral terms and the meaning of our moral concepts, that would mean then that our moral concepts have to be names for certain kinds of sensations. Okay? But whereas words like cold and red directly correspond or directly name a certain kind of sensation. So again, if you don't understand the meaning of the word cold, I can provide you with a direct experience which provides the meaning of that word or the word red. Again, pending or assuming that your powers of observation are working correctly. Now, but if you ask me to provide you with a sensation of good or evil or right or wrong, I can't do that. I can't directly provide you with an experience of these kinds of things. I mean, so what do good and evil look like, taste like, sound like, feel like, those kinds of things? Okay, right and wrong. What does moral right and moral wrong look like, sound like, taste like, feel like, right? These kinds of things. I can't provide you directly any empirical information about the meaning of these words. However, what I can do with respect to good and evil, I can produce sensations or feelings of approval, disapproval, elation, disgust, shame, guilt. I can do that, right? And isn't this kind of the way we bring up our children? So, if I tell my children, okay, it was not good what you did, well, why is it good? Well, it hurts people, right? Or it causes disappointment, right? So I'm not saying we need to make our kids feel guilty, but you know, children's guilt feelings are particularly strong. So when children associate a given behavior with a given feeling of guilt, part of the idea is, well, that will keep them from engaging in the behavior, right? In the same way, if I put my hand on a burning hot stove and I don't like the way it makes me feel, that's going to condition my future behavior, right? I'm not going to do that again, okay? Now, so what Hume is, I think, what he's trying to do here is he's actually trying to make the best case scenario for our moral terminology. So Hume is not of the mind that our moral terminology is completely meaningless. So good and evil and right and wrong do name something, they just don't directly correspond to sensations, yeah, obviously in the same way that like cold and red do. So what our moral terminology and our moral concepts do is they indirectly name feelings of human sentiment. Okay? Now, but the main claims that Hume makes in his moral skepticism have to involve the idea that morality does not directly correspond to what Hume calls reason. All right. So a lot of past philosophers, both ancient philosophers and philosophers that Hume was contemporaries with, thought that right and wrong, moral um, distinctions. That's the word Hume uses. So moral distinctions are discoverable by reason and can largely be articulated in terms of reason, so much so that good and evil can be discovered by reason. And with respect to right action and wrong action, morally right action and morally wrong action, we can talk about how it's reasonable to be morally right and unreasonable to be morally wrong. So if these philosophers are correct, then that means we can discover what's right and wrong just by the operation of our reason. And any action which is immoral is going to be inherently irrational or unreasonable. And then correspondingly, any action which is right is going to be reasonable or rational. So if we can define right and wrong and good and evil in terms of what's reasonable and unreasonable, and in terms of what's rational and irrational, then that means that reason has a strong role to play in discovering what is moral. Hume denies this, and he has several reasons why he denies this. Okay, so first of all, Hume says that reason on its own has no influence on our will. Okay, so you do not behave the way that you do, and you don't decide to behave in certain kinds of ways solely in virtue of your reason, in terms of what you believe to be true and false, in terms of how you believe the world actually is. Okay, so Hume says that every time you behave in a certain kind of way, every time you act in a certain kind of way, you are acting in accordance with a sentiment. You are acting in accordance with a desire, an emotion, a volition, something like that. Okay? So reason on its own has no influence on our will. Reason on its own does not produce behavior. However, morals do influence our will. So as Hume says, morals awake the passions within us. So I use the language of right and wrong, and I use the language of good and evil, and what does the usage of those terms tend to do? It tends to produce certain kinds of feelings or sentiments within individuals. Okay, so let me give you an example. Suppose you really believe it is wrong to punch people. Like if I were to sit you down and say, okay, and I show you a video of a guy just walking down the street, just punching people at will. And I say, do you think this kind of behavior is wrong? And you say, well, yes, it's wrong to punch people. That's not a nice thing to do. It hurts people, and there's no moral justification for hurting people like that, and so on and so forth. But then I ask you, have you ever punched somebody? So you believe it's wrong to punch people, that you're morally blameworthy for punching people. But if I ask you, well, have you ever punched somebody before? And you say, well, yeah. Well, why? Well, because I wanted to. Right? So even if you really believed, like it was a strong conviction of yours that it's wrong, you're morally blameworthy for punching people, if you're angry enough and you want to do it enough, what will you do? You will punch people, right? Okay, well, that means that your behaviors and your actions are largely dictated by your passions, by your sentiments, your emotions, your volitions, and not by your reason. So that's part of what Hume means when he says that reason is the slave of the passions. So what role does reason have here? Well, I briefly alluded to it earlier. Okay, so reason helps us discover kind of what the source of our passions are. Okay, so my reason does play a role in me not touching the hot stove at a later date. So if I touch the hot stove and I don't like the way it makes me feel, it produces a sensation of pain. Later on in life, I'll remember, well, last time I touched the hot stove, I didn't like it, so I think I'll avoid it this time. I mean, that's practical to do that. Now, I may not necessarily know that by touching the hot stove, I'll get the same reaction, right? So Hume is skeptical about the reliability of induction, but we're not going to go into that, right? But reason can help me discover what kind of the source of these sentiments is. So if somebody gives me a taste of a beer and I like it, I'm going to say, ooh, what is that? And then if they tell me the name of the beer, or they show me the bottle, right, later on in the future, I will probably purchase that kind of beer. Why? By recognizing the bottle at the grocery store or something like that. And oh, yeah, I remember that. So reason does play a role in making those kinds of discoveries. But will I purchase that beer because simply in virtue of the fact that I know, by reason, that I liked it before? No. Here I'm relying upon my sentiments. I'm not relying upon my reason. Okay. So once again, reason itself has no influence on our will. Reason does not produce behavior. It does not produce action on its own. However, our morals do influence our will. So talking about what's right and wrong and talking about what good and evil does have an influence on the will. Well, since reason itself has no influence on our will, but morals do influence the will, it must follow then that morals are not derived from reason alone. So moral distinctions are not derived by reason. That's why it's the name of the article. Okay. Now, and furthermore, Hume says that reason involves the discovery of truth and falsehood. I mean, that's kind of the job of what our reason does. So your beliefs, so to the extent that your beliefs either correspond to what's real or they don't correspond to what's real, by using reason, we can sort of discriminate between beliefs. I can say that your beliefs are reasonable or unreasonable based on the evidence that we have available, based on whether or not your beliefs correspond to the facts in the world, and so on and so forth. However, our passions involve instincts and desires and emotions and volitions. So where reason is the discovery of truth and falsity, our passions do not involve the discovery of truth and falsity. So your beliefs can be reasonable or unreasonable, but since it's not the job of your passions to discern between truth and falsehood, your passions really cannot be reasonable and unreasonable on their own. So again, indirectly, they might be reasonable or unreasonable in terms of trying to discover the source, right? So if I have a bad day at work and I truly desire to make myself feel better, it would be practically unreasonable for me to go put my face on a hot stove. Why? Because based on my past experience of touching hot stoves, I have reason to believe that it will produce the opposite sort of feeling. I won't like it. I will hate it. It will produce pain and not pleasure, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, but directly speaking, it's not the job of the passions. It's not the job of your instincts and desires and emotions and volitions to discern between truth and falsity, which is why the passions really cannot be rationally scrutinized here. Okay, now, but if your actions, if our actions and our behaviors are produced by the passions and they're not produced by reason alone, to the extent that the passions cannot be rationally scrutinized, it seems that our actions and our behaviors cannot be rationally scrutinized either. Okay, now, but part of what we are doing when we are making moral evaluation, at least according to this kind of more traditional view of morality as actions being moral and immoral means that they're either rational or irrational, we are attempting to cast human behaviors and actions under rational scrutiny. But to the extent that our behaviors and our actions are based in the passions and not based in reasons, to the extent that our passions cannot be cast under rational scrutiny at least directly, our actions and our behaviors cannot be rationally scrutinized directly either. Well, that means that morality, to the extent that traditional morality has been the attempt to cast our behaviors and actions under rational scrutiny, to the extent that those actions and behaviors are based in passion, they can't be rationally scrutinized. Okay? All right, and then the last thing I'll mention here just concerns the nature of our moral judgments and the nature of our moral evaluations and whether or not they count as knowledge. Okay, so again, this goes into things that Hume says just about the capacities for knowledge in the first place. Well, Hume thinks that there are only two kinds of knowledge possible, and those are relations of ideas and matters of fact. All right? Okay, now, the denial of a relation of ideas results in a contradiction because all relations of ideas do is report the way that we use words. All right? So an example of a relation of ideas would be something like all green grass is green. All green grass is green. Well, if you deny that, you're saying some green grass is not green, and that's clearly a self-contradiction. So there is something that is green grass that is not green. That would be absurd, okay? But it's also the case that there aren't any interesting relations of ideas. So by interesting, Hume means, well, he uses the language of, relations of ideas do not attempt to inform the understanding. They don't attempt to say anything interesting about the world. So keep in mind, when I say all green grass is green, that's true even if nothing actually exists that is grass and nothing is actually green. So all green grass is green does not imply the existence of grass. It also does not imply the existence of green. In the same way, all figatigabigaboos are figatigabigaboos. That's just kind of a logical truth. It's what we would call kind of analytically true. But if you ask me what a figatiga-bigaboo is, I don't have any idea. I just made it up. So it's true, all figatiga-bigaboos are figatiga-bigaboos, but I'm not saying anything interesting about the world. I'm just saying all members of a class are members of that class, but I couldn't tell you what the hell a figatiga-bigaboo is, okay? Now, well, why is it that our moral judgments or moral evaluations don't fall into this camp? Why aren't they relations of ideas? Well, first of all, the denial of a moral judgment is not a contradiction. So if I say murder is not morally wrong, that's not an obvious contradiction in the same sense that some green grass is not green is a contradiction. So our moral judgments, our moral evaluations can be denied without pain of contradiction. Well, that must mean then that they're not derived by reason. Now, and secondly, our moral judgments correspond to human behaviors and passions, and hence they do attempt to say something interesting about the world. So two reasons why our moral judgments do not are not sort of discovered or derived from reason. One, the denial of a moral judgment is not a contradiction. And two, nothing derived by reason is interesting, but all of our moral judgments are interesting. Murder is morally wrong, friendship is morally valuable, those kinds of things. So I'm trying to establish some kind of connection between a sentiment and a behavior or event in the world, and hence I'm trying to say something interesting about the world. But since our moral judgments, their denial is not a contradiction, and they all at least attempt to say something interesting about the world, that means that our moral judgments don't correspond to reason. Okay, now matters of fact correspond to experience, which means first of all, they could always be different. So Hume says nothing in experience nothing that corresponds to experience, logically speaking, must continue. So just because we experience the world one way today doesn't mean we are going to experience it in the same way in the future. Okay? Now, but what we do with moral judgments is we attempt to establish a necessary connection between an internal sentiment and an external behavior or event in the world, right? So take the judgment, punting kittens is morally wrong. Okay, so we've got the act of punting kittens, and then we've got the moral predicate or moral judgment. The punting kittens is morally wrong. So the act of punting kittens, the behavior or event of a kitten being punted, is the kind of thing that has the property of being morally wrong. Okay, now, but given Hume's analysis of moral concepts and moral language, what does moral wrongness correspond to? Moral wrong names a sentiment, a feeling of disapproval or disgust. Okay, now, but what this means is that technically what we are saying when we say that punting kittens is morally wrong is this. Anyone who witnesses a kitten being punted will have a certain sentiment produced within them, a certain kind of sentiment of disgust or disapproval or sadness or sorrow or empathy for the kitten. Okay, so what we're trying to do with our moral judgments is establish a necessary connection between the sentiment, the feeling of disgust or disapproval or blame, and the event or behavior itself, the act of punting kittens. Now, but if I say anyone who witnesses a kitten being punted will have this disposition produced within them, that is why I'm trying to establish a necessary connection. But here's the problem. Necessary connections cannot be established on the basis of experience. You cannot say how the world is going to be in the future simply on the basis of the fact that it has been that way in the past. So our moral judgments do not correspond to reason. They can't be derived from reason. They also cannot be justified or derived by experience. But if all of our knowledge is in those two camps, then our moral judgments, at least straightforwardly, do not count as knowledge. Okay? All right, I've got 10 seconds. So I know this was a bit complex, but if you have any questions on this, as always, do not hesitate to email me.